Welcome back to our theater stage for our next panel. Have a seat. And we're going to talk about a concept that some of you might not have heard of, but it's a very important one. The title of our panel is Balancing Planets, People, and Profits. Let's strive for a regenerative economy. Now, many of you have probably heard about a circular economy. A regenerative economy is similar but different, and it's a pretty good thing to strive for. We're going to hear about this in a moment. But first, let me quickly introduce our panelists. Only a very short intro because each of them will have a short impulse to start off our discussion, and then we will have a discussion, and you can also ask your questions. Please welcome with me Bennett Bart. He's the Managing Director of Respond at BMW Foundation Herbert Quandt. Thanks, guys. Friedhof Detzner, the co-founder and general partner at Planet A Ventures, right next to him. Now you have to keep this, you know. Eva Maria Kirstieper, the public policy director, sustainability at Meta. Philipp Birker, the CEO of Climate Farmers. And we have Franz Josef Allmeier, who doesn't speak German instead with this name, which was interesting. He's the founder and co-creator of Hyper Earth and Integrity Earth, and we will learn soon what this is. Welcome. Now, as I told you, we start with impulses, and first, you might want to know what a regenerative economy actually is, and Bennett is going to tell us, so Bennett is having the first impulse.
I feel like I earned all my credit before starting. This is great. No, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting us on stage, and it's great to talk about the regenerative economy indeed and what it is. Just maybe disclaiming up front, I think it's very hard to actually know what a regenerative economy is, but I'm confident that we'll get a little bit closer in the next 5 minutes. So my name is Bennett, Managing Director of Respond. As you heard, Respond is a program that was initiated by the BMW Foundation about 3-4 years ago. And what we do is we work with business leaders and innovators across the globe to help scale innovation, sustainable business models, and empower responsible leadership along the way. I can't see my slides, and I can't forward on the slides.
Okay, you got a PDF. Sorry, you have to look in the back.
That's okay.
You were pretty late with your slides, like 1 second before this panel started.
So I'm glad we're meeting not on this day. It's a week before this day. But I do want to start with the question, July 28th. Does any one of you know why July 28th would come up in this context? Any guesses? You have a guess, you know. So July 28th is actually when Earth Overshoot Day is going to happen in 2022. And this is next Thursday. So the global one, yes. And that's a very good point, and I'll come back to that point in a second. So the global Earth Overshoot Day is going to happen on July 28th. If someone can forward on my slides, I can't seem to be able to do it. Tech, please. Thank you.
Yes. Working on it. There it is.
So, Earth Overshoot Day, what does it actually mean? This means that by Thursday next week, we, across the globe, collectively, will exceed what basically the planetary system is able to regenerate in the time frame of. So after July 28th, after Thursday, we will actually be starting to run deficit in terms of what our planet is able to give us to operate on. You can see actually in this chart that Earth Overshoot Day is on different days for all the different countries. So the global one, as was mentioned, is next week. But there's obviously countries that are much earlier in the year, and there's also countries that are much later in the year. So the question within that is already coming up here is a question of justice. So sort of who is using those resources, how are we deploying them, etc. Now, Earth Overshoot Day being in mid-July feels a little bit like burning through your annual budget, sort of halfway into the year because of your overly excessive lifestyle. And the natural thing you would do is basically go to your bank and ask for a credit. And the planet actually behaves in a very similar way, right? The rivers continue flowing, the ocean is still around, the wind is still blowing, the sun is shining, etc. So we will be able, luckily, to operate and continue operating on this planet, also after July 28th. But we will run a deficit, which is on my next slide. The ecological footprint that we cause has been exceeding what one planet Earth can give us for the last 50 years. Ever since 1971, we've consistently been exceeding the planetary sort of systems and what they're able to give in a very consistent way. There has been sort of minor dips, but in general, you can see we've been building up a massive deficit over the years. And the thing is, so this year we'll be we'll be needing 1.75 Earths, and I have pain in pronouncing Earths even because it sounds like a very sci-fi sort of framing of having multiple Earths. It's pretty weird. So we'll be using 1.75 Earths just to keep our system going throughout the year. Now, when I talk about system, obviously Earth is a terribly complex system. So there's more things to look at than, for example, carbon emissions, or there's more than just biodiversity. And there's a very helpful framework on my next slide, which concerns the planetary boundaries framework. This is a framework that was developed at the Stockholm Resilience Center by Professor Jan Rockström and his colleagues. And what it does is basically it dissects the systems that we're living in, the planetary system, into 9 different categories that range from, for example, climate change over to biodiversity, over to all kinds of different things such as freshwater use, biochemicals, etc. And the way for you to read this chart is basically that within that inner circle, where it's nice and green, this basically tells us we are in a safe operating space. So we are not sort of exceeding the planetary boundaries. We're not using more than what the planet is able to regenerate within the framework of a year. And this is where you could say operations are stable and sustainable, because in this scope of things is where we can sustain the way we live on this planet. Now, in all those aspects where we reach beyond the planetary boundaries, and the further we get out, you actually increase the risk of permanent damage, irreversible tipping points being crossed, that just in the future will not allow us to go back to normal. And I'll say this again, crossing the planetary boundaries will cause irreversible damage. It will not allow us to go back to the status quo, or the status as we would need it to go forward for a longer time. So this actually, for me, raises the questions. You can see it in 5 out of 9 systems. And the majority of those systems, we're exceeding the planetary boundaries. And there's even one in them where science still hasn't fully understood where the boundaries should sit. So it might be 6 out of 9 even, which is daunting. It's the majority of our planetary systems that are just in big trouble for the sake of being on stage. So the question really is, how do we think about sustainability going forward? And to me, in my mind, sustainability is the sweet spot that we should strive for, but it's happening within that inner circle, within the green space. Once we made it into that inner circle, we can talk about sustainability, because this is where we're able to sustain sort of our way of living on this planet. For all the things where we are exceeding it, we actually need to shift our language, shift our mindset, and shift our operations to a mindset of regeneration. We need to make sure that we bring down those dark red levels of exceeding planetary boundaries to something that is more in line with what actually is understood as sustainability today. Now, on the next slide is, for us, our vision of a regenerative economy. It is a fair and inclusive economy, and this is speaking to the point of all the different countries having different points in time where they sort of overshoot on their systems. It's a fair and inclusive economy within the planetary boundaries. And the second paragraph on that slide is where I think a lot of work needs to be done going forward. It is, so a regenerative economy is for us an economy that thrives on regeneration and that does not thrive and avoids actively exploitation of natural resources and human well-being. And this is where the major mindset shift has to happen. This is where really we need to understand that our current economic system is not reflecting this kind of thinking. It is not putting a value behind regeneration in itself, and it is not going to last or help us very much going forward.
Thank you so much, Bennett.
You're very welcome.
that was a good closing point. You know, get the idea of regenerative economy. Sorry, I have to speed up, and he told me I can interrupt him if he goes so
I
long.
did. Fair enough.
He was speaking about the values. Like that leads us to the impulse of freedom, because reaching this regenerative economy has to be a business in order to achieve it like as fast as possible. And I think that you as a VC, that's where you jump in.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for.
Yeah, just give them a second.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation, Bennett. I think that was really.
Oh, it's
Give it a second.
the second is over.
Cool. Then I take this one.
Yes.
Cool. Thanks, Bennett. Exactly that framework which you described, the planetary boundaries, I think it's a really good and holistic understanding of the problems we have. And it's a lot of problems. And maybe to your point, like we talk a lot about climate crisis, but for example, we don't talk lots about the loss of species. And this is one of the tipping points where we just lose them and we can't turn this back. So framing and thinking about the problem is like it's super complex, and we need to, I think, accept that sort of complexity when we think about this. So what do we do at Planet A? So we are a normal VC, but then again, we are not a normal VC, because what we're doing is we have a fully employed scientist team, and whenever we think about it, if we invest in a startup, yes or no, we look through two angles, or two eyes. One is the classical VC perspective. It's like, hey, this is a growth model, this is something worth investing, there's a market, it's all gonna be like the normal business case. But here's the thing which is not normal about us. We're fully employed scientists, and that means whenever we look at an idea of a startup, we look quite holistically at all the mass and energy balances of an idea of a company, of a product. What does it mean? Basically, we compare today's world with that idea, and I'm gonna throw in a little bit of some examples later. But when we look at a startup, we basically look where are the resources are coming from, how much energy do you need to extract them, how far you need to transport them, what kind of energy do you use for the production, and then not only the production, like also the use phase. How often do you use a product? How much energy do you need each time? And what's the end of life scenario? And that's super complex, obviously, and that also consumes a lot of time. Like we're going to spend 100, 200 hours of scientific time to do this life cycle assessment. But if you do it, and I'm going to throw in the examples later, for the idea of a startup and for today's world, you can really tell if this is part of the solution, yes or no. And as you described, the numbers are clear, how much more we consume than we actually have. And I think it's not magic. We just have to look at the numbers and decide where to allocate the capital. And I think we can't continue to go on and gonna throw the money at any problem that's out there which seems to be good. I think we have so limited time that we really have to allocate the resources to the startups that are making the meaningful difference. And the only reason to really tell which are the ones that are doing it is actually to take science into account and give science the power to veto any deal which is not significantly better than today's economy. Otherwise, we're going to have the same graph going down that road, and it's going to be even worse. And the funny thing that this is an innovation. Like if you think about this, that taking science and looking at the numbers into account in an investment process is an innovation, which I think shouldn't be an innovation. Like looking forward, that should be normal. So if you think about this is all the VC cases you were able to invest from a VC perspective, we're only going to take the ones which also tick the boxes towards an economy within the planetary boundaries, and the other ones we just don't. So it's not as simple as that. So hopefully regulation, activism, and all of that will help to expand this inner bubble, if you stay with this picture, that more of the investment cases and more technology is not contributing to that image we don't like, more towards the one within the planetary boundaries. And so when we invest, and then I'm going to finish soon.
Thanks. But I got some follow-up questions.
Not going to top Bennett, right? Sorry. So how would you do it? Like we invest quite broadly, food, synthetic fuels, buildings, everything. but then we look quite specifically what's the impact of the idea. And maybe to throw in 3 examples, and then I'm done. One is, for example, for sustainable shipping. We know shipping is needed. We live in a world where we transport things, and we know that shipping is actually contributing to 3% of the global greenhouse emissions. Okay, and and we know we need to decarbonize this as well. And there's a startup we're backing which has produced a new method, a new catalyst for green methanol, which brings down the cost of green methanol by quite a bit. So it will be an alternative to shipping fuel. Another example would be Traceless, an alternative to plastic, to virgin plastic, and they use secondary waste streams, streams of food production, so the parts we don't need for our day-to-day food. And they're using that to do a plastic alternative whenever it gets in contact with water and microorganisms, it really breaks down completely. And since it's a byproduct, it really saves 83% of CO2 as well, and also no negative effects on biodiversity and so on. So that's how we do it. And the only thing I want to say, it's in the end that simple. You need to take the evidence of the science into account in the position where the power is when you make the call whether to invest, yes or no. Thanks.
Thanks, Rudolf. And Traceless is a response startup, so that was a good example. Thanks. Now we hear from another company that is not a startup, but that has to play a major role in almost everything going on the globe. We are excited what Eva is going to add from Meta.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Eva Maria Kirschsieper, and I'm Policy Director for Sustainability for Meta, the company formerly known as Facebook, for those who don't know. When I joined the company, we were actually a startup, so that's like 11 years ago. We're definitely not anymore. And I'm also not in a role anymore that I had. I led the policy work for DACH, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And since about 2 years, I'm leading our sustainability policy work for the region. And of course, the question also, I think why I was invited is the question what companies and what technology, what role we can play and what responsibility we have in the broader context of a regenerative economy or within the economy as such. And of course, I think we do have a massive role. I mean, we're a massive company and therefore we have massive responsibility. And when we think about sustainability, we're basically thinking about it in 3 terms. First, on how we operate, then what we create, and how we collaborate. I will be very brief. How we operate, that's sort of what I consider always what is our homework. How do we energize our offices, our data centers? How do we consume our energy? And that's sort of what we currently, I think, are in a quite stable situation. We are at 100% renewable energy for all of our operations. We have reached net zero for our operations in 2020, and we have some ambitious goals to be net zero by 2030. And we also have a goal around water to be water positive by the year 2030. But I think, of course, the other elements are a little bit more interesting. Is there no further?
Maybe in this direction.
Oh,
there it is.
Yeah. So how we, what we create and how we collaborate, I think, is more important here. So what we create, we try to apply important principles such as circularity, which we embed into all of our constructions and all of our products that we have. And as you may know, we're increasingly becoming a hardware company, building VR devices, etc. So circularity is very important in that context as well. And there's another important area that, of course, as a company, as a communications company, where we have a massive role to play, is in how our products are being used. And we, when we talk about climate change and the climate crisis, I always say that we also have a climate communication crisis. So we, as a communication company, have an important role to play there. So, for example, we have just released our second climate change opinion survey with the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication that was surveyed across almost 200 countries across the globe, amongst 100,000 people, where we try to evaluate how people think about the climate and where they are in terms of knowledge and how much they hear about climate change, for example. And that type of work is very important A, because it can inform policy decision making, but it can also inform further research that can then be built on. And just one number that kind of freaks me out is that amongst that survey that was just released, Spain is the country where 65% of the population think that climate change is at least partially man-made, and the 65% is the highest percentage across the whole universe, across the whole globe. So across all the 100,000 people we've asked, that's the highest number. So there is a significant deficit in people understanding yet that climate change is man-made, and that is important knowledge for policymakers and for how we communicate to people to make them understand where we are. And because if you don't think climate change is man-made, you also don't think that people or that humankind is responsible to reversing it, right? So this is just one example that I wanted to highlight, but we're also using the platform to inform people. We have the Climate Information Center that sits on a platform that reaches 100,000 people each month, where we build in information from authoritative resources in Germany. It's the Potsdam Institute, it's UNEP, and some others. And we're also, for example, using the platform to inform people about climate myths. So the information of people is an important element for us to make use of what we have across our assets. And I'll just very briefly touch on the last piece, because that's, I think, the key in all of what we do is that we cannot do any of that without collaboration. So all of those things that we do, we need to collaborate with science, we need to collaborate with policymakers, and we need to make sure that, for example, the information that we bring in front of the people is science-based and has the backing from the most knowledgeable experts. So that's just 3 examples of what we do, maybe just to highlight one, because I also think that's something that's, that people might not necessarily think of when they think of Meta. We have a Green AI team, and that Green AI team, for example, partnered with the University of Illinois on building a new carbon-efficient concrete. And in early testings, they created a concrete that is 40% more CO2 efficient than traditional concrete, using, for example, additional or recycled material like ashes or glass to create that type of cement that we will then use for our own construction for the data center, but that can, of course, also can be used by others, because we typically open source the type of findings and innovation that we have as a company.
Thank you, Eva. Now everyone is going a bit longer, but it's interesting, so I didn't interrupt now. Now we come back from the corporate level to 2 startups that are part of the Respond Accelerator for a good reason, as you will learn now. And we start with Philip from Climate Farmers.
Cool, nice to be here. Well, the good thing is that Bennett already spoke a little bit about what I will be speaking about, so I can be a bit brief in the beginning, if this works. There we go. Planetary boundaries. I think Bennett already explained perfectly what it is, so just 2 quick fun facts on that one. Agriculture is right now one of the major contributors to all of the 9 planetary boundaries, and just to put things a little bit more in perspective, Fridtjof was talking about the 3% from shipping. Agriculture is responsible for 24% of all greenhouse gas emissions. That's major. The good thing is we have a solution to all of this. This solution is called regenerative agriculture. You might have heard about it in the last 3 years. It became a bit of a hype term. If you haven't, watch Kiss the Ground. Great documentary that can explain the background that I don't have the time for at this moment. But it does help with a lot of these things. It helps, for example, also with a massive fertilizer crisis, which we have right now for farmers. Fertilizer prices increased by 800% in the last year. That's like a math book suddenly costing 26,000 euros. And we also have the issue of water shortage, we have a biodiversity crisis, we have a carbon crisis. All of this could be solved through regenerative agriculture. We have already a bunch of studies on this topic, especially from America. From these studies, we know that if you build up soil health, which is essentially the core part of regenerative agriculture, you capture carbon, you build biodiversity, and you also reverse erosion. For example, we had the floodings in Germany and the Netherlands last year. Those happened because of our degenerated soils. If we would have healthy soils, the floodings would not have happened to the same extent. However, it's not scaling. Everybody's talking about it. Pepsi's making commitments, McDonald's is making commitments, Unilever is making commitments, but it's not really happening at a large scale. When we started with Climate Farmers, we expected about 1,000 out of 10.5 million farmers in the European Union to be regenerative. Now, the number is somewhere between 10 and 50,000 a lot more, but still nothing compared to the 10.5 million farmers that we have. What is the reason for that? We believe the reasons are twofolded, if they're coming up. Otherwise, I can already start with it. One reason is definitely we don't have model farms. So one thing that you might not know about farmers, farmers only trust other farmers. They talk to other farmers, they trust other farmers, they don't trust the city boy that's coming and trying to tell them what to do. And the issue is that we're having is, we don't have a lot of regenerative farms in Europe. So what we believe at Climate Farmers, once we have 10% of all farmland under regenerative management, the other 90% are going to be easy. Because at that point, any farmer can go to another farm, can look at what's happening in practice, can talk to the farmer about experience, and can be like, that makes sense. I want to do that too. So that's the one thing which we want to go to. The other thing is, I think, an interesting one for the overall topic that we're having of regenerative economy, because it's a core issue that I believe in our society is what we're paying for. We're not paying for the true cost of things, which is a concept you might have heard about. In terms of farming, the big issue is we're paying for produce. All that the farmer cares about is how much produce do I have, how much money do I get for that. He does not get paid for soil health. He does not get paid for storing carbon. He does not get paid for building biodiversity. So unless we as a society start paying farmers that have a positive benefit on our planet for that positive benefit, they will not start doing it. Farmers have an issue with finances generally. 60 to 80% of all farmers are dependent on subsidies. So we cannot expect them to invest more money to bring more benefits for all of us without seeing any money for that. Huge issue in our society. I know this for agriculture. You could do the same for any other business as well. So where do we get from here? With Climate Farmers, we've been working for 3 years now on this topic. I spent 1 year visiting farms, talking to farmers, and figuring out from these pioneer farmers, which are doing this job without getting paid for it, what do you need? What are the issues? As said, knowledge and finances are the two key ones. So also a fun fact, there's no university in Europe that teaches you regenerative agriculture. There's some organic universities, which are still far away from where we are, but there's basically no possibility of learning about this. Schumacher College in the United Kingdom is a private college. They are now the first ones offering a regenerative agriculture master. So the first thing that we need to create a mindset shift for farmers. We need to connect farmers with each other, and we need to enable them to get the knowledge that they need in order to do regenerative agriculture in their specific context. Because as always, agriculture is very context specific, so there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And the second part, as already mentioned, we need to measure the regeneration that's taking place on the farms, and then we need to start paying for it. This payment should be coming from government, from society. Currently, it's mostly coming from private companies, which are trying to compensate for the CO2 emissions. So based on the learnings that we have done at Climate Farmers in the last 2 years, we basically developed a few projects, which I just quickly want to share.
Very quickly, please.
Okay. So one thing is farm enterprise analysis. So we're essentially helping farmers to figure out what's going on my farm, what's my soil context, how financially viable are the parts of my farm, how is the climate change risk for my farm, and what role could regenerative agriculture to scale that. Second one, community as a service. Very fun one. Farmers like to talk and learn from other farmers. We try to get them on Slack. We try to get them on Mighty Gathering. They're all on WhatsApp. So essentially, we have lots of WhatsApp communities all over Europe where the farmers are talking with each other, and the support they give each other is amazing. Like, it's really interesting to see on what deepness level they go, because many of them feel lonely because the conventional farmers around them all think they're crazy for what they're doing. The other part is a transition blueprint process where we're essentially helping companies to transition their supply chains. So we start with the mindset of the farmer, analyzing the business of the farm, farm context, ecological context, then creating a plan together with our consultants and other farmers, and then implementing build, measure, learn, and running experiments on the farm. Another one is about basically measuring the regeneration that's taking place, automatizing this, feeding the data back to the farmers so that they can, again, implement their practices and that they know what's working and what is not working. And then lastly, the product which we're currently mostly selling is basically carbon plus credits or regeneration credits, which are essentially helping farmers to pay the transition costs which they're having when they're building up soil health, that transition phase that takes 3 to 5 years, by having companies which are local to them paying them for this in order to compensate for their CO2 emissions. And finally, I don't know who's in the audience, but the way how we're thinking at Climate Farmers is always systematically. We try to only do things which others are not doing and which are necessary. So we're always looking for partners and other organizations which are interested in joining us on this journey of regeneration. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Philip. And it seems like you're already partnering with one of our panels here because WhatsApp is a meta platform.
Yes.
Now we're talking not about a platform, but about a decentralized system.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for having us, and thank you guys for being here. My name is Franz Josef Allmeyer. And going back to your point, I am born in Guatemala, and it's also something that is very relevant here because I would love to introduce to you a lot of universities that are still in that consciousness of what regenerative economy is, and that's kind of like the background. You know, the regenerative agriculture is essentially the de facto agriculture that we've had across time and across the planet. It's essentially an ancient future technology. My contribution to this space is essentially a question of bringing what do we value and how do we value it. And at the core of this is essentially something that is often overlooked, but at the same time we recognize that it makes the world go round. But we also recognize that it's also the way we've organized this is at the core root of a lot of the problems, and that is money. In order to kind of paint a picture of what a regenerative economy could look like, first of all, maybe let's look at what a degenerative economy is. So essentially, currently we have a handful of people deciding what the values are for the rest of the planet. These people are creating essentially money out of debt, which puts a vacuum of pressure to kind of transform our natural capital, our cultural capital, our spiritual capital, and transform it into merely paper-based money, which at a printing bank can be printed at the tune of trillions of dollars. And then if you compare that to a world where, for example, our farmers are receiving subsidies at the tune of trillions because it's a petrochemical, but at the same time our fossil fuel industries are also receiving trillions of dollars of subsidies. So we come up to a world where actually the world is running on the petrodollar. Without addressing that core challenge, you can put all the petro money in the world and it's actually only going to make the problem even worse. I came across this in my career, working for organizations such as United Nations, Clinton Foundation, across academia, and realized, wow, there are so many amazing small-scale projects doing amazing things against all odds. And here you have the giants who are kind of more invested in the status quo, of course, because it's all about maximum profit at whatever cost. That's the name of the game currently, which somehow or other we're all complicit because we share in this ritual of exchanging that little dollar sign or euro signs or whatever the currency is. So looking back, I looked at the indigenous communities that have been using seeds, and one of the ideas was there, okay, how can we create a value-based network where essentially we include the users of the currency to have a voice and integrate that value? What happens if you integrate the scientists behind the money system, the agriculturalists behind the system, the users of the technology behind the monetary system? And what we came into, it was a very, very fascinating, or is a very fascinating experiment. Right now we have 10,000 people all across the world already rewarding for regenerative contributions of multiple forms of capital. And it's growing without any cent of media or public relations, just through word of mouth. What happens when, for example, you're right now in the first time in human history with blockchain, we're able to measure the velocity of money in real time. So we're also able to balance the supply of currency to the demand for exchange, which essentially creates an intrinsically stable form of currency, which is able to outcompete the system in its own game. So what we're unleashing is essentially regenerative market forces that are community-owned and directed and governed. So that becomes a very exciting thing because what we're unleashing is essentially another form of capital that goes beyond the reductionist understanding of capital to be merely paper money and encompasses that natural capital, that spiritual capital, that cultural capital into a token. That when you compare, and we have a world where people are demanding more value and more voice. So what we have is essentially an opt-in system that allows people to honor those values and interact with one another, creating essentially a peer-to-peer market of conscious consumers and conscious producers in a participatory relationship. And the beautiful thing is, from that place of empowerment, it becomes a peaceful fight because essentially also power over others becomes redundant. So that was the first sort of horizon that we did, essentially a horizon 3. We call it seeds. We have a global passport, minimum viable tools for communities to self-organize and create value together. In that process, we learned, okay, we need to perhaps take it a horizon back, and we created the DAO tools. So essentially right now we have the tools for any sort of value-based network to come together, create their token according to those values, and govern that token according also to their cultures. And what we're unleashing there from the bird's eye view is essentially an open source economy based on pure transparency, inclusiveness, and radical purpose. And that's, I think, why this Web3 time is so exciting, because we really have the opportunity to transition into more healthier ways that are really serving people and planet.
Thanks. Now, as there's not so much time left, I want to pick up two arguments that were made quite a few times from different perspectives. I want to pick up something that Fritjof said when you were talking about all the VC cases out there, and you pick the ones that make scientifically sense for saving the planet. How many of those cases that are currently in the circle are left if you do this scientific, measurement?
Not many. And that's a problem. But like, to be honest, it's like you only get the sense of these two bubbles if you take in the scientific approach. Otherwise, it's a blurred image. Like it's guessing, right? And I would say, basically, we are in the problem that we are because we know the science, but we haven't integrated science into policy making, into investment decisions, and into the processes where it really matters. And we need to do that. And if we would do that, then this inner bubble would increase in size, right? So any activism which holds governments accountable for future regulations are creating new chances for startups to do that. Like one example, which is super easy to grasp on, it's like we invested into one company which doing synthetic aviation fuels, right? And the EU says by 2030 we want to have 8% drop-in quota synthetic fuels, and it just needs to happen. And that 8% goes to again 100% over the next decades. So policy making is super powerful, and actually no, it needs to happen. And that is obviously creating chances for startups to say, hey, we need to do that. That innovation is really needed also from a government perspective. And so there's the power, as well as plastic bans and other sorts of regulation. And that really is us as society coming together saying, hey, we need to change the boundaries of the system, and what do we finance, where are the subsidies for bad stuff, and how would you change that to like, I just want to say it's complex, but I think the point I want to make is if these startups in these inner bubbles, they win, we all win.
Yeah. So the key is activism. Then we have regulation. Then this regulation creates a market for great startups. Yeah. Now, Bennett, you have you are in the startup field, and you know a lot of startups that are trying to solve global problems. How hard is it for them to get funding and to have the market? I know there's a lot of idealism, but there has to be funding and money too.
Of course, yeah, there has to be money fueling this, even though we can discuss the meaning of money in the first place. No, but obviously this is much harder for many of the impact startups. And it goes back to the question I raised earlier. What are the things that we value in the economy? And is it just the 10x scale and the return on your capital that you're looking for? Or is there other things that you value inside of your investment thesis? And obviously, I think it's no secret that it's much harder for impact-driven startups or climate tech startups. I'll get to that in a second. It is still much harder to acquire capital because oftentimes if they're really meaningfully and truthfully committing to impact, then the complexity of the problem makes the investment case just equally complex and more difficult and more capital intensive perhaps, etc. So a lot of the system that we see nowadays in VC, for example, is just not fit for purpose to meet these complexity challenges, right? The lifetime of the investment cycle is in many ways too short, and the return expectation is critical, and the expertise sort of on the VC team. So something that I've been seeing a lot, for example, is like VCs with very strong financial track records. So by all means, from a financial perspective, you would say this is like an A-player VC, using the same tools, the same platforms, the same mindset to address climate questions, for me is underestimating and sort of underserving the complexity that this actually carries within. So, thanks. So this, obviously there's great people like you guys working on this, or you guys, and changing that paradigm, and there has been a new wave of funds really hitting the market and a new way of thinking about this, which gives me a lot of hope, but it still is a long shot, and it's still a terribly complex and difficult challenge for entrepreneurs that like you guys or other startups in the Respond program to really find this momentum in the market, definitely.
Now I wanted to jump to another point. It's the point of awareness, and in the general public, but also in VCs or in special branches like farming. Did you look into the reasons why the number of people who believe in man-made climate change is so low, and do you work on ideas on how to increase those numbers?
Yeah, so maybe one important thing is that we at Meta don't do that because I don't think we should be doing that. We're not equipped. We don't have the science. We don't. So we are partnering with others, such as Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And yes, they do that. And for example, when you mentioned you're from Guatemala, you said you pointed that out because that's something that we also saw in the surveys, that obviously in South America and where indigenous people live, there is a much closer connection to Earth, and there's a much higher awareness, and there's a much higher willingness to interact and to be active. So those are things that those surveys demonstrate, but there's also generally the question and again, we can provide a platform that kind of gets that data, and then with the help of others, we can see what we do with that, such as the Climate Myths campaign that I mentioned briefly. We know that there are some common myths, such as climate change is not man-made, some people think. So in partnership with Yale, we did create that climate myth debunking campaign that we put out on a platform just recently in Germany. And so we're exploring. Of course, you always have to find the best way then to communicate that to the people, because that's another huge challenge, to find the right way to actually reach people's minds. And that's sort of where we all need to kind of work with the information that we have and with the science and behavioral change knowledge that can be gathered also. And then, again, use the platform to get that information to the people. That's something that we try to support as good as we can. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, I mean, working with organizations like you, I will definitely reach out to you after this to see whether there is anything that we can do with our products to elevate your voice and to make sure that you can use those products better. So I think that collaboration and network and partnership is essential on any of that.
Great. Maybe some unlimited Facebook advertising budget. Philip, how hard is it for you to get funding and to fund your project? Because you are, sorry to say so, you are, educating people, you are supporting farmers that don't really know how to make money off a regenerative economy, so agriculture. So how do you make money and how are you funded?
It's a good one. So we touched very much upon what happened with Bennett. So to be very honest, I was quite shocked when I entered the whole impact VC world, because it turns out that a lot of impact VCs apply the same metrics as a normal VC and then impact metrics on top. So if you're a founder, it's actually worse to fundraise as an impact startup than if you don't have an impact startup. And on top of that, if you're working on system change, if you're working on agriculture, if you're working on climate change, and then you have someone who's an impact VC and is telling you on the other side, yeah, we have like a 3 to 5 year horizon, you're like, how the fuck do you see this happening? So we are quite happy, because in the end, we signed now with an impact VC, which gave us an 8 to 10 year horizon, which is Rockstad in the Netherlands, and definitely a shout out on that one. And then there's another amazing field out there which is emerging, and that's really cool. I think there's a lot of young people which are coming into powerful positions, which is where a lot of change is happening. We see this as well in companies. For example, Danone, etc., which are getting now suddenly CEOs and leaders which are younger and which are seeing that they change things. And a lot of younger people are basically inheriting wealth. So out of most of our investment is coming from angels. So we have angels which are a lot easier in the process, which don't have the same obligations, which are also completely acknowledged, which a VC has, of returning money to the people which feed the fund, where a lot of the issues are coming from, I think. And that is one large way of founding it. And then with Climate Farmers, we also had the luxury of winning the Google Impact Challenge. Google puts every year 10 million into a pot to solve one of the world's issues. And I have to say, before that, I would also not have thought that, but it was a very nice process, because they gave us 650,000 euro grant, no strings attached, never asked again. The policy is they do a good screening before, and if they do a good screening, they don't have to do controlling. So they did no controlling. So we could have theoretically bought a house somewhere with it. But we did decide to hire 22 people and spend all of it on salaries. Very expensive hobby, by the way. And then what we're having a lot is we're working with so-called impact heroes as companies, which are interested in compensating the CO2 emissions. You can compensate a ton of CO2 very cheaply for about 6 to 12 euros, somewhere in the global south usually, where you don't have a direct relationship to it. In order to make sense for the farmers, we're selling for 50 euros a ton. So that's way above the market price. But the nice thing is, again, because of all the climate change, because of all the, I think, younger people moving into things, there's a lot of impact companies out there which don't just want to be able to say they're CO2 neutral, but they really care about the impact that they're making. So what we are doing is we're connecting them on a local level. So we're connecting the company with the farmer, and we're trying to build a relationship between the two of them so they can visit the farmer, and that way they're actually willing to pay that premium price of 50 euros a ton, and that way it actually makes sense for the farmer to go in that direction, and that way we can start scaling up and getting more and more farmers to transition because it starts financially to make sense, and part of the cost of the transition phase is covered through this. What I'm really hoping for is two new things which are developing, which is the focus on biodiversity, which companies are not paying for yet, but it's slowly coming, and this is a major one as well. And we have a super exciting study right now running with EIT Foods together on nutrient density. Because most people might not know this, but the food that we're eating is a lot less nutritious than we had it 8 years ago. Orange is the best example, 8 years ago. Orange is the best example, with 1/8 of the nutrient density that you had before. And there is studies from America already that show that nutrient density in regeneratively grown food is higher than in conventional. So I believe once we can be showing this, that it's actually healthier for you to buy it, I'm really aiming at the parents that want to take good care of the kids, and not just for the future, but also for the now. And I think that will fuel a lot of money into it.
That's great that we have some nutrition details here, but yeah. I want to pass the term system change that you used and pass it on to Franz, because all of you are working on kind of transforming the system. Franz is aiming for bigger system disruption, I guess. So maybe you could tell again what's the reaction, for people? You want to empower people, you want to empower peer-to-peer communities. And you're coming from the Web3 space, which started with cryptocurrencies, like very monetary driven, even if it's about other forms of money and not about saving the world, not in all places. So what's the reaction? Are people jumping in and joining the DAOs, or is it hard?
Yeah, people are joining, and the beautiful thing is that what we offer is more value and more voice into the ecosystem that you inhabit. So that is really attractive to anyone, really. And they see it in a world where, for example, all of the things that we value are falling into a market failure. This is essentially an opening, a way to transition that is able to give them the value that they're looking for, and also voice into that ecosystem. One exciting thing that we have also in this perfect storm of pantheon of problems that the world is facing right now is, again, the problem of inflation, where central banks have inflated currencies to the tune of trillions. So yeah, at the same time, all the money that, for example, VCs, family offices have been having, there's a scramble for looking where to invest that money. And what we have, especially in our design of our token economics, is essentially a medium of exchange that is able to maintain value across time. And not only do that, but also utilize that value to serve people and planet. So from that, and you put it all into a world of transparency, it really becomes a exit from degeneration and a smooth transition into an insit for humanity, as we like to call it. The challenge is also the challenge of awareness and consciousness. That's kind of the biggest one, because as we've been stuck for centuries, sort of in this mindset of seeing things in a reductionist point of view, it's really hard to kind of bring back that openness and move beyond this siloed way of thinking into more of a holistic understanding of what's at stake, what value is. But at the same time, these tools are making it accessible. So at the same time, you think about the unbanked of the world, all the people who have been or are still living in a regenerative way, doing the regenerative agriculture. They're in the other side of that scarcity picture, where from essentially if you have centralized finance, you have essentially money in central places, and everywhere else is in a scarcity. But now when you have internet and you have access to mobile phones, what we're looking into is a rural renaissance where anyone can actually opt into alternative form of exchange and start exchanging the abundant natural capital that they've always had. And that's what gets me excited.
Great. And I'll try to close our panel in a positive note, which is pretty hard regarding the circumstances. Now we have the climate crisis going on. I don't know who heard the keynote of Veronika Eyring this morning. She reminded us of how fast time is running, and we have to have our CO2 emissions by 2030. It's almost tomorrow. We have a war going on. We have inflation. We have energy crisis. So what makes you still optimistic that we can make this transition towards a regenerative economy like in the time given? Anyone who wants to start can start. And yeah, as always, keep it short.
As I mentioned, I think there was a perfect transition from what I said before. What we're seeing right now is essentially a coming into stewardship that every person is right now seeing through and becoming a captain of spaceship Earth. And, it's again, we think about it from a centralized system, but what we're seeing is this rural renaissance or this regenerative renaissance where all of these perfect storms are pushing people to question the status quo and looking for alternatives. And if those alternatives are accessible enough, it can really happen like this, and especially from a collaborative edge where now we have the technological means through blockchain, through transparency, through inclusiveness to make all of these engines of change contribute towards the same common purpose and goal, then transition can happen extremely quick.
Ifa, you want to add something?
Yeah, just wanted to add, the people here and also organizations like World Fund or the VCs that are present here, I think the innovation that we will be able to see, I think is really what we need to make things happen. That's kind of what keeps me optimistic, and also and coming from a situation from a company that typically doesn't get a lot of love, which is I'd say I don't say that with any pain because it's just the way it is, but I can see that people are we all have a common goal, and the fact that we kind of can collaborate with people who don't even like us, right? But they know we just have one chance. And if we don't fix it together, we won't fix it. I think that's kind of the understanding that people are willing to actually overcome certain fears or anxieties that they may have, that they still do it because they know there's no other option.
Yeah, but save it. We have only 2 minutes, and then you can give a big applause to all of them. Philip.
So just quickly, I can just say for myself, I got a lot more hope in the last 4 years since we started with Climate Farmers. So initially, before Climate Farmers, I had like a backup plan B of like a village in Portugal, which I was working on, which got me into agriculture. And my plan was, okay, if all hits the fan, then I go there. But now I have more and more the feeling there is a movement, there is stuff that's happening. There's large companies like Patagonia, there's companies like Ecosia, which are driving the change from there. There's also the companies which used to be evil, which are changing. I think that's a very interesting one, which I'm realizing companies are living organisms, right? They're changing when the leadership is changing. And that's what you see happening. Like I was active for Zukunft for a long time where we were working against Nestle and against all of these food corporates. And now there's suddenly people, and the new CEO of Nestle, I think he really means what he's saying. And a lot of these people are realizing they cannot continue with business as usual. There's a societal change as well, where people are suddenly not really showing off or getting things anymore with driving around with their Ferrari or their Porsche. So I think with all of this changing and with the mindset of people changing and sustainability being more and more celebrated, we have a chance. The question is just if we're going to be quick enough. But the movement is definitely going in the right direction. We just need to find a way to speed it up. And that's, I think, the biggest issue. If we can speed it up in time to avoid the whole system collapse. And that's what I'm not sure about, but we can definitely try, and we can all do our best in doing that.
Fridtjof and Bennett has the closing words then.
Do you want to go first?
No, he has the closing words.
Oh, okay. I want to build on you, I really think it needs all of us, and I really mean all of us, and it needs corporations, startups, but us as individuals or activism and all of that. And I would just wish for any individual or any organization to think about what's the biggest lever that they have, right? For some it might be how they invest their time, for some it might be regulation, for some it might be activism, or where to put the money. And I think it needs all of us to concentrate on the biggest lever and not on just small side fields, which I tend to see a lot. And I would wish basically for everyone to take up the responsibility and like really mean it for the things they can do. And therefore I would say it really needs all of us.
Wow, this is a hard task now. I will say all of the above, first of all. No, so the thing that came back to my mind was July 28th, which is next week. And so the thing that I'm going to put out once again is next Thursday, maybe there is a 5-minute slot in your agenda that you can take a moment for yourself and reflect on what are the systems that you're in, what are the levers that you're able to play, and go out and do play them indeed, and do take action, because I think it's time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Now, there's no Q&A now, and you know who's responsible for that. But thank you anyway. Feel free to grab them after our program is over in the yard, except for Eva, she has to leave now. But I guess she has a Facebook profile, so hit her up there. And even LinkedIn. Yeah, we are actually communicating on LinkedIn, we have to admit. Thanks so much. That was very exciting. And now we prepare for our headlining keynote of today with Maya Güppel in about 2.5 minutes. So just stay here. Thanks.